Hello, and thank you for joining for today's panel on sustainability in aviation. I am Danielle Imperato, and I will be your facilitator or moderator for today. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Dr. Christoph Wolff. He is the Global Head of Mobility at the World Economic Forum, where he leads the Clean Skies for Tomorrow Coalition, a cross-industry initiative aiming at scaling up sustainable aviation fuels to decarbonize aviation. We also have Daniel Riefer, an associate partner based in McKinsey's Munich office. He focuses on operations and sustainability and is a platform fellow with the World Economic Forum, where he supports the Clean Skies for Tomorrow Coalition. Daniel also leads McKinsey's cooperation with the World Economic Forum in the context of Clean Skies for Tomorrow. Finally, certainly not last, we have Julian Holton. He's a senior consultant based in Hamburg, Germany. He was the project leader of our engagement that resulted in the hydrogen-powered aviation report, of which we will see some important insights today. Julian focuses on strategy projects for the renewable energy sector, including hydrogen as well as air mobility. So I hope you will all join me in a very warm welcome for our panelists today. And before I hand it over to them, I will have just one quick note of housekeeping. So we encourage you to submit questions throughout our briefing today. To do so, you can find the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you go to the Q&A panel, you will select all panelists from the drop-down menu, type your question, and click send. Now, for confidentiality, none of your questions will be attributed to you. Only the panelists will be able to see the questions that you enter. Again, if you have any trouble with audio or dialing in, please select webinar producer from the drop-down in the Q&A panel, and you can also type there to request assistance. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our panelists who will begin the briefing for today. Oh, actually, one more note, not quite housekeeping, but some exciting things to come. We'll have a number of themes that we cover today, which touch upon some of the work that's already been published by McKinsey in our report. One, how airlines can chart a path to zero carbon flying, as well as the hydrogen-powered aviation report, the fact-based study, both released in May. And very exciting, in the next couple of days, we also have the Clean Skies for Tomorrow Sustainable Aviation Fuels report, which is slated to be published again tomorrow. So look forward to that as well, and we'll review some of those insights. So with that, I will now turn it over to our panelists to start us off. Oh, Daniel, you might be on mute.
I am. Thank you very much. So today we would like to talk about three topics. At the beginning, the case for action and why aviation is a hard-to-abate sector. Thereafter, I will talk about sustainable aviation fuel feasibility and sustainability that relates to the report that will be published tomorrow. And then lastly, Julian will take us through hydrogen and aviation opportunities and implementation challenges. So on the next page, I would like to start by comparing different sectors on their path to decarbonization. So if we assume an imaginary straight line towards almost decarbonization in 2050, we see how a number of industries significantly improved and reduced absolute emissions compared to 1990. Not so transportation, which has even increased CO2 emissions during the same time frame. But we should acknowledge the efficiency improvements transportation sectors have accomplished. So CO2 emissions per airline passenger, for example, have significantly improved with new aircraft and engine types. However, these savings are overcompensated by industry growth. The next page. So all sectors have to decarbonize, and all stakeholders demand increased efforts to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So this includes investors, employees, and of course, customers. So last year in summer 2019, before Corona, we asked about 5,000 travelers from around the world on their concerns related to climate change and willingness to pay. So a couple of learnings. Firstly, a third of travelers consider to fly less because of climate change, and 8% answered they definitely plan to fly less. Almost half the respondents are willing to pay a premium of at least 2% of the ticket price to travel environmentally friendly. So that's for a US dollar 1,000 ticket, more than 20 US dollars. What we don't see on this page is that younger travelers, particularly in the age range of 25 to 34, are much more sensitive about the topic of climate change. And these are the future customers and employees. So the variance between regions, by the way, was much lower than between young and old. Next page. So what can the industry do to fight carbon emissions? So first, as a global industry with airlines competing across borders, aviation is not part of the Paris Agreement. However, years before Paris, the industry has set itself aggressive targets. 50% CO2 reduction until 2050 compared to 2005. Not net neutral, but still a significant challenge. Fuel efficiency is likely to consider at a lower rate than before. Efficiency of jet engines is almost maxed out. Pilots try to fly economically, and air traffic management is trying to shorten routes. So these efficiency measures could help to almost offset the expected industry growth. However, if we want to bend the curve downwards, it's really hard. It takes new fuels and radically new technology to decarbonize towards industry targets and even beyond to net zero. So on the right side, you'll see a couple of reasons why it's hard to decarbonize aviation. So first of all, it's the high energy density that we need to transport high payloads and high weights over long distances. As mentioned, it's a cross-border industry with international competition. The infrastructure today is built around fuels. And any new energy source like battery flying, like hydrogen flying, would disrupt the supply chain. Aircraft are long-lived assets. There are aircraft flying today which are way beyond 25 years old, so it would take time until a new technology scales in the global fleet. And then lastly, aviation is very safety-focused, so any innovation requires certification and approval. So energy density is a critical argument. So you see a couple of energy sources here on that map that compares volumetric energy density and gravimetric energy density. Liquid fuels, including sustainable aviation fuel, provide high energy per kilogram and per liter, making them efficient from a weight and volume perspective. Hydrogen, in the lower right corner, is light and provides even more energy per kilogram than fuels, but takes lots of volume and larger tanks, even when liquefied under low temperature. Today's battery technology is not yet mature enough to power large-scale aircraft. A battery with the energy of 1 kilogram of fuel would weigh 50 kilograms, and it doesn't become lighter throughout the flight. Next page. But there are more dimensions to consider when comparing energy sources in aviation. The first is the climate impact. While all concepts here on this map, from sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen fuel cells, and hydrogen turbines, allow to reduce CO2 to net zero, hydrogen also reduces non-CO2 effects and achieves an even better climate impact reduction. Sustainable aviation fuel allows to minimize the disruption of aircraft design and operation, as sustainable fuel is certified as common jet fuel. Hydrogen requires modifications of aircraft operations, and infrastructure. So let us now take a closer look at sustainable aviation fuel. And please, Christoph, take us through the Clean Skies for Tomorrow coalition. You're also on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and greetings to everybody. Indeed, over the last year, the World Economic Forum, which is the International Organization for Public-Private Collaboration, has been building the Clean Skies of Tomorrow coalition. And the Clean Skies of Tomorrow coalition is a broad coalition across the whole value chain, including airlines, including airports, fuel providers, governments, international organizations, NGOs, civil society, because we are very much convinced that only through consolidated action, concerted action across the whole value chain, you can actually make lasting changes. As an international organization, we're also closely connected by ICAO, and we work with IATA, the Airline Association, ATAC, the organization which actually out of IATA that works on environment, and ACI, which is the International Airport Association. And we have actually worked with this coalition on 5 work streams. First of all, in order to lay the groundwork for decarbonization pathways with sustainable aviation fuels, we did, together with Mckinsey, work on SAF sustainability and feasibility. Basically, the SAF analytics about cost models, about economies of scale, etc. So please stay on the last page, yeah? One page before. And Daniel will go into detail on all of this. This is the report, basically, that is scheduled to come out tomorrow. The second work stream is on what we call democratizing global SAF. As a matter of fact, most of the growth in the aviation sector comes from developing countries. But also, a lot of the opportunities that are associated with sustainable aviation flows sit with developing countries because they could become production hubs for bio-based fuels as well as for e-fuels that are synthetic, are basically. So these two work streams provide the base. But in order to make a real impact, we need enablers to make it happen. The first enabler is about policy. We all know that the sustainable aviation fuels, and Daniel will show that for the time being, will be more expensive than kerosene. So we need policies in order to ramp up the investment into sustainable aviation fuels and to bridge the cost gap and to come out of the chicken and egg situation where today, while it is technologically possible, nobody demands. There's no demand for sustainable aviation fuel because it's more expensive, and therefore it's also no supply. The second enabler, work stream number 4, is aggregating demand that is willing to pay more for sustainability in aviation. And I think Daniel showed on the first slide that there is some willingness to pay more. And we are working as a World Economic Forum, especially with our partners from the technology, from the professional service, and from other sectors for whom the carbon footprint for aviation is the largest carbon footprint at all. And they very much want to actually decarbonize their whole, also their Scope 3 emissions, and they're looking for creditable and recognizable way of doing so. We're building a market in order to scale SAF purchase. And the last one is about finance. The last work stream is about finance. We're bringing together the bank, the investor, that basically would be willing to invest into production plans for sustainable aviation fuels and for ways to de-risk those investments, because as a matter of fact, there are technology risks there, so there are demand risks, and as long as there is no basically the fixed demand from airlines and no blending mandate yet, and there are other risks to take into account. Only through those, we think that only through those 5 work streams and the implementation of actions along those, sustainable aviation fuel will really thrive. And I think today with Daniel and the team, you get an insight about some of the factors that will be important to make this future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christoph. And Building on this, so in our work with the Clean Skies for Tomorrow Coalition, we focused on 4 different pathways that enable significant CO2 reduction and can be blended up to 50% with conventional fuel. So these 4 pathways are firstly HEFA fuel, or hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, alcohol to jet, gasification, Fischer-Tropsch, and power to liquid fuels. So the first one, HEFA, is made from waste and residue lipids, such as used cooking oil, but could also be produced from sustainable vegetable oils. HEFA is also the only pathway that is fully commercialized today, mainly through the road industry that has been using this type of hydrotreated vegetable oil also in the past. And all aircraft that are flying on sustainable aviation fuel today use this type of sustainable aviation fuel. Alcohol to jet allows to use any sort of biomass, such as agricultural residues or wood residues. Gasification with the Fischer-Tropsch step uses the same feedstock as alcohol to jet, but allows to also tap into municipal solid waste as a feedstock. And lastly, power to liquid or synthetic fuels that use CO2 as a feedstock, either from the industry directly or from direct air capture. Using renewable electricity and hydrogen, CO2 is then converted to sustainable aviation fuel. All of these fuels enable significant CO2 reduction from up to 85% for HEFA fuels, and when using direct air carbon capture with green renewable electricity, power to liquid fuels can achieve up to 100% net CO2 reduction. So on the next page, we have an outlook for the next 5 years in which HEFA will likely play a dominant role. So total volumes, however, remain small. Today, in 2020, we have a production of around 200,000 tons of sustainable aviation fuel, which is all HEFA fuel, and less than 0.1% of the global jet fuel demand. So this supply, or this production volume, is going to increase over the next 5 years to around 4 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel. Still, the majority, with around 85%, will come from HEFA, and there are only few projects announced around alternative pathways, such as alcohol to jet and gasification Fischer-Tropsch. Today, there are not yet announcements of significant scale for power to liquid fuels. Okay, next page. So what is the amount of feedstock available to produce sustainable aviation fuel? In a first step, we selected sustainable feedstock types and then sized the availability of each. We worked with reports that are publicly available, but also Mckinsey's Acre tool, which provides information on feedstock density based on geospatial information. Using typical conversion factors, we translated the feedstock availability into practical volumes of sustainable aviation fuel and other products like road diesel, gasoline, and others. The result you see here. So HEFA feedstock is rather limited and could be converted to around 85 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel per year, compared to almost 400 million tons from biomass and municipal solid waste. CO2 is obviously unlimited. So here the bottleneck is renewable electricity to produce synthetic fuels. So bottom line, there is enough biomass available to convert sustainable aviation fuel equivalent to the demand of the entire aviation industry in 2030. Next page. Let's have a look at costs. So during our work with the World Economic Forum, we built a sustainable aviation fuel cost model that looks bottom up at the different cost drivers, feedstocks, and for example, we looked at more than 30 different feedstocks. We looked at different pathways at HEFA, alcohol to jet, gasification, Fischer-Tropsch, and power to liquid fuels. We looked at different feedstock sources, and finally at OPEX and CAPEX costs. So that allowed to produce cost curves for the next years, as you see here on the right side, split by different cost drivers, and also a marginal abatement cost curve that combines the cost of sustainable aviation fuel from different sources and production pathways, and also the total availability. So on the next page, we see the summary of the outcome over time. Again, the 4 colors reflect the 4 different production pathways over time for 2020 until 2050. So what do we see here? First of all sustainable aviation fuel types are becoming lower cost and cheaper over time. This is due to scale effects, due to lower cost green electricity, and learning curves, for example, around electrolyzers. What we also see is that HEFA fuel is the lowest cost today, something around $1,500 per ton of fuel, which will stay relatively even due to the high share of waste oils, which is a commodity and is expected not to decrease much over time. Gasification alcohol to jet fuels we expect to remain slightly above. However, they tap into a feedstock resource which is almost abundant, or at least much higher than HEFA fuel. So in a scenario where we see a fast sustainable aviation fuel scale up, we will also need to tap into these pathways and biomass. Lastly, for power to liquid, we see relatively high cost and also a high cost range today, which is due to different technologies like reverse water gas shift or co-electrolysis, but also different electricity costs for different regions. And these costs, however, will significantly reduce over time. So lastly, what we also see is the comparison with the jet fuel price. We estimated this to be around $600, which is similar to the cost before COVID. And we see that these sustainable aviation fuels will not reach the cost of fossil jet fuel. That means to make this economically viable, we need some sort of demand stimulation. So next page. So what does it take to scale sustainable aviation fuel? So first, there is a technology challenge. We need technological maturity and cost reduction, particularly for fuels like power to liquid, that we expect to come down in cost significantly. We need a scale up to capture scale effects and more efficient electrolyzers. Secondly, regulation and financial instruments. We need to see policy frameworks that stimulate demand, may it be through CO2 costs, landing mandates, or emission trading. We also need sustainable aviation fuel investment for bridging the cost gap to conventional jet fuel. And then lastly, a sustainable aviation fuel marketplace and accountability, so similar to what Christoph introduced, to give customers, may it be private or corporate customers, the chance to decarbonize through sustainable aviation fuel, avoiding any double counting. So with this, I would hand over to Julian to take us through the hydrogen and aviation work.
Yes, and as you can, or as you will see in a second, this also has a lot of interconnections to what Daniel also showed already. And just starting from the motivation, as you saw, that the decarbonization levers, that hydrogen technology is also one of them. So I will present now kind of the insights from the study on hydrogen-powered aviation, which was published in June this year. And we conducted the study for the fuel cells and hydrogen and the Clean Sky and the Clean Sky joint undertakings. And it was made possible with the funding of the European Union. You can download the report on the website of the joint undertakings. As you can see here on the left, there were 24 organizations involved with them. We worked together, and a big thank you to them as well. Together, we developed a fact-based perspective on hydrogen-powered aviation and evaluated whether hydrogen has potential, what technology developments are necessary, at what costs it could be realized, and what challenges need to be overcome. In total, the objective of the study was neither to give predictions or to have a detailed technical feasibility study. It was more the purpose to understand whether hydrogen has potential, and therefore whether serious research and development efforts should be devoted towards its development. So we analyzed the aircraft design and the infrastructure required, and the focus was on hydrogen propulsion. So this means, if you look into the aircraft itself, It could be either an aircraft that react hydrogen and fuel cells and then power an electric motor. It could be an aircraft that burn hydrogen and turbines, or a combination of both, so a hybrid hydrogen aircraft. Our findings demonstrate that hydrogen has significant potential to decarbonize aviation alongside other technologies. So it's not the only solution and already answers kind of some questions I can see in the chat. And we will give you some outlook for kind of what could be the role and the part of the solution. So first, let us take a look into the climate impact again, what Daniel already said a bit about, but why this might also be a driver for hydrogen aviation. Here you can see that it's not only about the CO2 emissions, but also beyond CO2. So, for example, nitrogen oxides, soot, water vapor, and then also the creation of contrails and cirrus clouds. And these non-CO2 emissions also have to be considered as well to look into their climate effects. So to assess the full contribution, you need to consider both emissions. And before we do that, and I guide you through this matrix here, it's very important to say that this is still an ongoing scientific debate on how much these non-CO2 emissions contribute and also how they all are translated into one aggregate measure. In this study, we used the concept of global warming potential, and that was measured in CO2 equivalents and over a time horizon until year 2100. So for conventional aircraft, research shows overall a climate impact that could be 2 to 4 times compared to the effect from CO2 emissions alone. And this breaks down into the different aspects. So if you now look into the available technology and new fuels, we see this changing by introducing these. So starting with the CO2 here on the left, synfuel produces CO2 emissions in flight, but can offset these emissions, as Daniel already said, when, for example, from biofuels, etc. But also if you really want to have a clear net zero, you would extract the air, the carbon from the air. Hydrogen propulsion, therefore, does not produce any CO2. On NOx and water vapor, synfuels are similar to kerosene, whereas hydrogen combustion, so in a turbine, could reduce NOx emissions, and fuel cells would not cause any NOx emissions. For water vapor, though, hydrogen causes more, and this is just still a scientific debate, of course, but we see that for the low duration of water vapor in the atmosphere, this will still have a limited impact on climate. And lastly, an important effect to consider is also the contrails and the cirrus formation, where we see that the climate impact with both synfuels and hydrogen could be lower, which is due to lower degrees of substances called aromatics and soot. So with hydrogen, soot could actually be fully eliminated. If we now combine all these climate effects and then also ranging the impact for uncertainties, we can conclude from this that the synfuels could reduce climate impact by 30 to 60%, hydrogen combustion by 50 to 75%, and fuel cells by 75 to 90%. So bottom line, hydrogen could significantly reduce climate impact, both for CO2 and non-CO2 emissions, which becomes increasingly important if regulation, for example, would not only look into CO2. As I said, though, there are still a lot of uncertainties that have to taken into account, of course, and one recommendation from that study was that there is more investment needed to research these effects. So let us have a look into the methodology we applied to look into the potential of hydrogen. So we started by clustering the commercial aviation sector in 5 different segments. You can see them split by their PAX number on the left, so from commuter to long-range aircraft, and in the range being flown with these aircraft, and projected the CO2 emissions here. So what you can see as key messages from this slide is that roughly 2/3 of CO2 emissions come from flights operated by short-range and medium-range aircraft, so 81 to 250 passengers. And these aircraft also account for 70% of the global fleet. Secondly, less than 5% of the CO2 emissions come from regional and commuter aircraft segments, and the rest comes from long-range aircraft. What we now did in the study was to have one concept aircraft for each of the segments, and we designed them and analyzed them. And here you can see a first result, looking into the technical feasibility for the aircraft design itself. So on the right here, you see the aircraft, which is an exemplary aircraft for the short range. So it can transport 165 passengers and fly 2,000 kilometers. Just for the framing, it's important to also mention our partner here. So the simulations for the aircraft concepts were done together with the German Aerospace Center. As you can see, this aircraft looks really familiar probably to you. It's a classical tube and wing design. It's also very close to an Airbus A320, and just with the difference that it's modified to fit in a hydrogen tank, a fuel cell, and also a hydrogen turbine. And in our analysis, we found 4 different challenges that need to be overcome to make this feasible. So first of all, it's the liquid storage for hydrogen. You see it here. We would need twice as high energy density for that tanks that are already available for today. Then second, you have the distribution of the liquid hydrogen throughout the aircraft. And there it's really important to have reliable and safe systems that also prevent any risk or safety issues if hydrogen, for example, could leak. The third aspect are the fuel cell systems. So they need to be very powerful in terms of the power density, going up to 2 kilowatts per kilogram, but also in the absolute power rating, up to around 10 megawatts. And lastly, we have the hydrogen turbines that need to be developed, and with a special focus on limiting the NOx emissions, what I already highlighted in the climate impact overview. So these are quite ambitious developments, as you might imagine. And based on our expert interviews and the projections, we saw that it could be achieved, but it requires significant efforts behind this development. I will detail that more out in a second as well. Maybe just staying there 1 second on that slide. You can see that the liquid hydrogen would be fit into the fuselage to ensure that there are still enough space for the same amount of passengers, but this would increase the length of the aircraft. And our simulation has also shown that a hybrid propulsion system, which is pretty much in line with what Airbus just published on their zero-E aircraft concept, that a hybrid concept here would also be most economic for such a short-range aircraft. So we saw that in total, you could reach 100% decarbonization with such an aircraft, the 75% reduction in climate impact, and even a 5% reduction in energy demand compared to a conventional technology in 2035. And all of this could be made possible by entry into service in 15 years already. So it has the hydrogen and propulsion not only has an impact on the aircraft, but also on the infrastructure, as Daniel already highlighted. So on the next page, I will show you just in 2 horizons what are kind of the challenges that we see that have to be mastered here as well. So you see on the 3 rows, you see kind of the major aspects that are important for infrastructure updates. It's first the liquid hydrogen supply chain, then the on-site refueling and aircraft operations. And we split kind of the development into 2 horizons. The first one until 2040 and the second one from 2040 to 2050. In this first time horizon, we see that only commuter to short-range aircraft would be out on the market and would be possible to fly on hydrogen. Therefore, we do not see any insurmountable technical roadblocks. And the major aspects in that time would be that the hydrogen demand would be served from central hydrogen supply sites, and truck-based refueling and transportation would be needed. This would also not require larger infrastructure updates at airports, since you would only have hydrogen trucks there. As well, on the refueling times, we see that they would become longer due to the volumetric density of liquid hydrogen. But for short-range aircraft, we see still that it fits into current time windows for turnaround operations. However, even in the first horizon, it is important to come up with new safety procedures and new processes for ground operation. In the second horizon, we see that the challenges are a bit more challenging. Given larger volumes and also now medium and larger aircraft coming up to the market, we would need at scale hydrogen distribution and also supply at the airports, including liquid hydrogen and the liquefaction itself, as well as at scale refueling systems. And especially for medium and long range aircraft, we would see extended turnaround times, which would have an economic effect on the airline operation in that case. So what do these two aspects for hydrogen now mean for a scenario that you could imagine for the year 2050? So if we look into this, we came up with a scenario that has the overall goal to decarbonize the aviation sector and to have a result which allows hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels. So kind of the summary of what we heard now today. And we see both kind of complementary. In this scenario, we see that hydrogen-powered aircraft could significantly be important for the commuter to short-range segments and also half of the medium-range segments, depending there on the range being flown. And even with a later development of medium-range aircraft being probably available after 2040. And if you now look into these scenarios, you can also see that the rest would be powered by the long range, by synthetic fuels, which has then the effect, for example, that the long range segment, which we do not see as an economic option until 2050, would also be powered by synthetic fuels. In such a scenario, as a result, you see that 40% of the global fleet could be hydrogen-powered aircraft. We would achieve a net zero target for aviation, and we could even reduce climate impact by 45%, which is around 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent compared to a baseline for 2050. So this scenario illustrates that hydrogen could play an important role in decarbonizing the industry with syn fuels together. But however, for the hydrogen part, we must invest in R&I to achieve the projected entry into services dates. And here you can see kind of the derived roadmap we see for this. So in order to get where we want in 2050, these are the key enablers for hydrogen-powered aviation. We see 3 major milestones along the timeline. So in 2028, there would be the proof for technical feasibility and certification needed, most likely for a commuter aircraft, and also a short-range aircraft being demonstrated already. In 2035, this would then also extend to the medium-range sector, and there it becomes also important to have safe and efficient airport refueling setups. In the long term, we see that it would be also an interesting field to further pursue research and revolutionary aircraft designs. So, for example, the Maverick from Airbus. And we also see very large-scale refueling infrastructure being needed if you want to have very large volumes at airports. And so you could, if you want to have more look into these different aspects, so you can see here we detailed down for components, aircraft systems, infrastructure, and also the regulatory framework being needed, as well as we already seen it for syn fuels and SAF in general. Please have a look into the report and find out there more about it. So now you've seen our insights into what role hydrogen could play for sustainability in aviation. And before we now come to your questions, I would quickly summarize the key takeaways from the webinar. So the three main messages. We have shown that sustainability in aviation is a license to operate. So this means that the sector is under pressure to reduce its climate impact, and we see that evolutionary improvements may not be sufficient for this. To succeed with the challenge, we found that SAF and hydrogen are promising and complementary options. Secondly, there is enough feedstock to power aviation with SAF. So we showed you the different production pathways that would fit to the projected fuel demand of the sector. Therefore, regulation is required to also enable the relevant scale-up of the technologies. And the third message is that hydrogen propulsion offers even a higher potential to reduce climate impact, so beyond CO2. And this could be done by fuel cell and hydrogen combustion technologies. Nevertheless, we identified a significant R&I roadmap. It requires significant investments already today. So thank you for your attention, and now we're very happy to answer your questions.
Great. So thank you so much, panelists. Just as a quick reminder to all of our attendees, you can access the Q&A panel, the bottom right hand of your webinar module. If you don't see the Q&A panel, you can click on the little icon with the three dots and select Q&A from there. From the drop-down, you can select all panelists and enter your questions there. But first, just to kick off our session, if it's okay with you panelists, we have one question that came up, and I'm going to direct this towards Christoph. So we understand that there are potential negative externalities to the development of alternative feedstocks, particularly to those who are concerned with land use and environmental integrity. Christoph, how do we think about those risks as we explore pathways to develop alternative and synthetic fuels?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. About 10 years ago, there was a toxic debate about biofuels in particular going to either food systems or fuel systems, and with all the negative repercussions. And since then, there is a very robust methodology on life cycle analysis that would take also the indirect effect on land use change. And in the Clean Skies work, we're together with Mckinsey and together with environmental NGOs like EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, RSB, and others. So we have looked at every individual feedstock and basically have said, are they, from a life cycle perspective, are they really carbon positive, yeah, or not? We've only admitted to the feedstock availability analysis those feedstocks which are of highest environmental integrity. So there's no palm oil, there's no kind of soya oil, etc. So others which would come from edible crops. And in this, and specifically, we took the ILUC, this is the indirect land use change methodology, into account.
Yeah, and maybe I would just like to build on this. And so our feedstock sizing and sustainable aviation fuel sizing is a two-step procedure. So first, we selected the right feedstock, and here we looked at different criteria. The first one is conservation. So we excluded feedstock that are produced on land protected for biodiversity. Second one is carbon stock. So we excluded, for example, primary forests, wetlands, peatlands, and other areas with high carbon stock. Next one is soil health. So feedstock that would otherwise put physical, chemical, or biochemical conditions of soil at risk were excluded. And then lastly, on competing demand. So feedstock with primary use outside the energy sector were excluded, for example, animal feed. However, what we did not exclude is demand from other transportation sectors. So we sized the full potential, considering all sustainability criteria, but we did not make an assumption on which part goes into road or which part goes into shipping. We just attributed that in our analysis to aviation. And that is where we received the 500 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel.
Great. And so one of the big questions, or one of the many questions that we're seeing, and certainly a topic that is on the top of everyone's mind, is the current COVID crisis, right? Obviously, there's been a tremendous shift in the industry and shift to the pathway that the industry may take as it seeks to reduce emissions going forward. How do you see our pathway in the future of sustainable aviation evolving in the context of COVID? And can you share some of our thinking on this topic?
Yeah, maybe let me start on this one. So we believe that the aviation industry has a dual challenge here. One is rebuilding the industry and recovering from the pandemic, and at the same time address carbon emissions and regain this license to operate, as we said earlier. So it's quite interesting to look at also the interdependencies of the two. Obviously, in 2020, we had a massive decrease of carbon emission reduction, which is directly correlated with the amount of fuel that was burned. What we also see is that airlines have accelerated their fleet rollover. So many airlines have announced to either temporarily store or even outphase larger inefficient aircraft, maybe the old 747-400 or old Airbus 340s. So the average fuel consumption per aircraft is probably becoming better during the pandemic. What we've also seen is that quite a number of airlines have received government support, and that was often linked to stricter CO2 reduction commitments. Particularly in Europe, a couple of airlines, through these government aids, have agreed to reduce greenhouse gases over time. Going forward, we believe that we can overcome this dual challenge and get to a green recovery if we see stimulation in the context of the Green Deal, and there might need to be state subsidies and support to help airlines through this recovery and at the same time renew their fleets and also buy sustainable aviation fuel. And there is quite an amount of air passenger duties paid today that goes into the government budget that could be reallocated to the industry and bridge the cost difference between conventional fuel and sustainable aviation fuel. And then last comment, when we take a longer view, we do believe that COVID will also lead to some structural changes of customer behavior. So during the pandemic, we've seen that video conferencing works quite well. And we believe that the corporate segment will also see some structural changes. There could be 10–15% less corporate flying in the future based on these learnings during the pandemic.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So in continuing with these great questions that are coming in, we presented a scenario where alternative fuels or a mix of alternative fuels can be the future, right, of sustainable aviation. And now these alternative fuels would require major complex changes, not just to the aircraft themselves, but to broader infrastructure components manufacturing. This is quite a complex challenge. Do we view this as really a viable solution? Maybe Julian, you can field this. And what do we see as a viable pathway to achieve our sustainability goals?
Yes, and first of all, it's important to say that kind of this scenario gives kind of a first hint in where you could maybe go more with the hydrogen solutions and where more with the synthetic or SAF solutions in the overall sector. But I guess it has two dimensions. First of all, it's of course, about the timeline. So we definitely see SAF and also including the synfuels there as the transition pathway currently, since the development of hydrogen-powered aircraft will, of course, still take some while. And then also the second path is, or this second area you have to imagine is, of course, the different segments that you cover with these new fuels. And as we showed for such a 2050 scenario, that there would be the technical feasibility to power up to short range and even maybe half of the medium range aircraft with hydrogen propulsion. But there will still be, due to the long time of manufacturing ramp-ups, of having all the infrastructure being installed, will be a lot of time still to then also have synthetic fuels as a very important and viable option, even for the long-term scenario. But just in terms of kind of what you would need in terms of the investment, the impact on infrastructure, components, manufacturing, and maintenance, this also creates kind of synergies. So, for example, if you only look into synthetic fuels, they are also produced by hydrogen. And with already scaling up syn fuels, we would also, in the end, benefit from that for every other hydrogen-based technology. So burning, for example, hydrogen directly in an aircraft. And there it's also very important to keep in mind what Daniel said, that with synthetic fuels and SAFs in general, you wouldn't have that much change to the aircraft itself. It would be more or less just the fuel that is supplied and the certification, etc. And this means that kind of it mostly impacts the infrastructure and the transition. But then if we also go for hydrogen technology, you would only have the efforts, and it's really just, you saw that it's a significant R&I impact behind this, that you would need for hydrogen aircraft, new components, new aircraft system, and also the last step on the airport, a new refueling system. But it's feasible in our point of view, given the high R&I amount. Maybe Daniel, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, since you asked for the kind of winning pathway, let's do a double click on sustainable aviation fuel. And we believe that there is no silver bullet. There will not be the one dominating pathway over the next few years. We believe, given the scale up of sustainable aviation fuel, we will need different types. That's the one reason, just the demand, but also different regions in the world are favoring different pathways due to the availability of feedstock. There are countries and regions in the world that have very low renewable electricity costs, looking at the Middle East, looking at countries like Chile. There are countries that are just very rich in biomass that might favor pathways like gasification, Fischer-Tropsch, and alcohol to jet. So we believe that any regulation should be pathway agnostic, but it should focus on CO2 reduction and leave it to the market and leave it to the competition to scale the most appropriate pathway in different regions. One more comment that we haven't mentioned is the societal benefit that we see with the scale-up of sustainable aviation fuel. And I was just thinking about India in terms of biomass, etc. But there we saw that through the scale-up of sustainable aviation fuel, it could have positive knock-on effects, for example, on the waste collection system or on the reduction of pollution. Today in India, farmers burn some so-called stubble burning on the farms, and they could collect this biomass and turn it into sustainable aviation fuel or other biofuels instead. So we should also look at these societal benefits that can be quantified and are quite significant.
Great, and I think that's a really nice lead into my next question as you, Daniel, acknowledge some of the regulatory challenges, but also kind of bringing in the societal lens, right, to this problem. Actually, so for Christoph, I think you really well outlined the complexity of this stakeholder challenge. So bringing together public sector, private sector entities to make strides forward on sustainability in aviation. So, how do we think about overcoming the challenge of this, complex cross-industry stakeholder set, and what do we see as actionable next steps towards, a more sustainable world in terms of flying?
Yeah, very good question. It's often said that the key pathway to solving to bringing low carbon or zero carbon technical solutions into play would be a global carbon price, which would obviously basically reduce the carbon budget to until 2050, like in the ETS system in Europe, to zero. Unfortunately, we don't have a global carbon price, and it has been actually very challenging to establish a global carbon price across industry. So in the absence of that, different other policies are being looked at. And as a matter of fact, within the European Green Deal legislation, so there is actually a very clear goal to reduce CO2 within the EU by at least minus 55% until 2030. And in order to get there, the EU is looking indeed at mandates. And the thing about mandates is if you introduce them too early, mandates meaning so you have a blending ratio, a mandatory blending ratio of X% at a certain point of time. And obviously, if you did it too early, so there wouldn't be enough supply. So the timing starting with that is one element. And then the question is about ramping up. And this ramping up actually creates demand. And this is the most important also for making this investable, because there are, for each of the technologies, as that Daniel outlined, there are innovators, there are entrepreneurial companies out there that are willing to invest into that, but they can only do so if there are clear offtake agreements which are backed by blending mandates. So this will be an important point, and we see the EU potentially taking a lead. And we also see a process at a global level led through ICAO that will in 2 years have on their agenda the question, what is really the long-term goal? Is it minus 50%? Does it really go to net zero? And once that is established, there will be obviously the question, what is the policy option that goes beyond CORSIA, which is an offsetting regime, to make that happen?
Great. Thank you, Christoph. And I think with that, we are running up against time today. We've had, I think, an excellent discussion, some excellent questions to a very, very complex, challenging, but exciting problem. And I think we've seen some wonderful insights that have come out of this work and the conversation today. So thank you, panelists, for your time. For everyone here still listening, I would encourage you, there's a 1-minute survey that will pop up on your screens when you exit the webinar today. We would love your feedback. So if you have a moment, we would love for you to respond. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed this session, learned a ton. I know I did, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.